Well, hello and welcome to Live from the Eagle's Nest, coming to you from the National Conservation Training Center near Shepherdstown, West Virginia. I'm Randy Robinson here in the NCTC studio. Welcome and thanks for joining us. We're going to be taking a look at some action at our nest today. We've got our juvenile eagle in there now, 10.5 weeks old, and we've been smiling this week quite a bit because it's kind of fun watching the young one this morning about 9:30 kind of dancing around the nest, hopping up and down, exercising those wings, making us gasp a little bit, thinking it's going to go off the edge. And you know, they've got strong talons, so they're holding on, looking good so far. But we're very happy to have with us today our guest Richard Bailey. And we'll introduce Richard in just a few minutes. Richard is with the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. We'll be talking about eagle populations in West Virginia and some other very interesting details that I think you'll like to hear about and see from his slides. But just wanted to say thanks again for joining us. Go ahead and send in questions at any time. I see we've got some folks online here with us. Jesse from Tucson. Deb from up in northern Canada, Paul from Maryland, Jackie out in Sherwood, Oregon, and Lisa all the way from Hawaii. Aloha, Lisa. And thanks for joining us, everyone. This is all made possible through the Friends of the National Conservation Training Center and the Outdoor Channel. A big thanks to them for streaming for us. Also, all the great folks that are viewing, putting video clips online and on YouTube, answering questions, all the folks at Bald Eagles 101. And it's been a great season. Like I said, our young eagle here, 10.5 weeks old, very healthy. This year we're celebrating 20 years at this nest. It was started in 2003, and it gets a little bigger each year. Now that perch that you see the young one on, just a few years ago, that perch was about 3 feet above the nest. On the other perch on the left, that was probably a good 6 or 8 feet out of the nest. That gives you an idea how high that nest has grown in just the past 3-4 years. So it's part of their ritual to keep adding sticks onto it, especially in the fall and early winter before the eggs are laid. But these eggs were laid in mid-February. They hatched in mid-March. Actually, we had 2 eggs. One did not hatch, but the other one did, and that's who we're looking at now. Our first grade class from North Jefferson Elementary School here in Jefferson County appropriately named him Jefferson. He or her, I should say, we don't know the sex. I think originally viewers were kind of leaning towards a male, but now I think the consensus is a little bit leaning towards a female, just because of the size and the aggressiveness. If we happen to see one of the adults bring a fish in, you will likely see this young one jump off that perch very quickly, grab the fish, raise up the feathers, and what we call mantling, just aggressively take that fish over. That's kind of interesting to see. We've got a couple video clips to show you as well. Before we get into those, Rob, can we bring up that map and show our new viewers where we are located? We are just about 70 miles up the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. You can see that yellow star, NCTC, National Conservation Training Center, right along the Potomac River. Our campus is the main training center for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're just north of Shepherdstown, West Virginia. On the other side of the river is Maryland, and we have about 500 acres of beautiful forested and open areas. That's really perfect habitat for eagles. And a little bit later when we talk to Richard, you're going to see how the eagle populations and nests have quite dramatically increased over the last 20 years or so. We have a little bit of the footage of the Potomac, or that drone footage that we can show some of the habitat. Here we go. There's an island here, Shepherd Island. We've got a drone flying over it. And this is the habitat that the eagles are in daily. We see a limited view, the nest view. We've got a wide angle and a close-up, but the adults, this is their turf, and they are hunting pretty much through the entire day. And you've seen them, if you've been watching the camera, you've seen them bring lots and lots of fish in. It's been a very good year for fish. This is one of their favorite fishing areas. Been bringing in some big red horse suckers, and you can see there's actually 2 islands here, and below the islands there's some riffles where they like to fish. The river makes a big bend here called Terrapin Neck. You can see the beginning of it, but that's one of their favorite fishing areas. So hello to Lori G from PA, and again, thanks for joining us, everybody. We've got a couple of video clips to start off with. Rob, if we could take a look at that first one. And Deb Steck posted this one on YouTube. And we'll go back a couple weeks and just look at some changes over the last couple weeks. Now our young bird here has pretty much all of his flight feathers in. And here we have, let's see, what do we have? We're still loading that clip up. But the flight feathers, the primaries, those are the main flight feathers. Those are grown quite well. Here we go. And so here's Deb's video from May 26th. And you can see Jefferson there exercising his wings up on that stump. I believe this was the first day that he got on that lower stump, or the lower perch, and really given a workout on the wings, and gets brave enough to go all the way across the nest. We've been seeing that quite a lot over the last few days and the last couple weeks, really. But he seems to like that left-hand side of the perch there. Hasn't got up on the high one yet, but he or she is working his way up here. We have a little slow motion. You can see those big wings flapping. And that's, especially on a breezy day like this, that's the kind of motion they need to have to really get the feel of the air, especially when the wind's coming from the west. It's kind of like being in a wind tunnel. It gives the young bird the feel of the wind under their wings and helps to exercise their muscles and stretch out their wings and all of that. So it's kind of fun to watch. We've got another one from May 30th coming up here. If we could take a look at that one. We've got some nice close-ups. We zoomed in on young Jefferson there. This was back on May 30th. And you can see, you can get a nice view of his eyes and his feathers. As you probably know, the young ones will not get the white head and tail feathers until they're 5 years of age, between 4 and 5 years of age, when they become mating age. That's on past programs we've shown photos of how their feathers change over the time, and their eye color and their beak color as well. Now you can see his beak is kind of a darker color, sort of blackish, brownish there. But as time goes on, it will get more yellow, and by the time he's 4 or 5 years old, a nice golden colored beak and those beautiful golden eyes as well. So Jackie's got a question here. What is the size of the wings on Jefferson? Probably a good 6 feet at least. That nest is about 8 feet across, and it's about 5 feet deep. And so judging, if you look at the nest as 8 feet, I'd say his wingspan is probably a good 6 feet across. So yeah, he is growing pretty fast. And so I'd say his wingspan is having a little trouble with my microphone here. Here we go. Yep, so go ahead and send your questions in anytime. We'll go back and look at some more videos a little bit later on. But right now, I wanted to introduce Richard Bailey. Richard is with he's the state ornithologist, and he's with the Wildlife Resources section and the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. So Richard, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time. I know this is the busy time of year for you, but you've got some great slides and some new info to share with us today. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's also great to know that there are so many people tuning in from so many different places. I'm excited to give you a little bit of window into the type of bird work that we do here in the Appalachian Mountains region. And so for my job, I basically coordinate bird conservation for the agency. That has a lot of different components to it. From education and outreach of the public to research to conservation planning, all manner of different things. And so I'm going to highlight a couple of the things that we get into here in West Virginia, and I'm going to focus first on eagles. I'm going to talk about bald eagles and the history of bald eagles in West Virginia, their history, how they're doing now, what some of the big threats are that still face bald eagles, even though they are doing remarkably well, as are a lot of other raptor species. I'm going to talk a little bit about golden eagles in West Virginia. One of the things that people don't realize is that there is an eastern golden eagle population, and there's a concentration of golden eagles here in the central Appalachian Mountains. And from there, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools we use, in particular the MODIS wildlife tracking system, in terms of how we learn about how birds move and how that can inform conservation actions that we take as an agency along with our partners. And lastly, I'm going to give a little bit of a big picture overview of birds and what some of our particular priorities are here in West Virginia. As you might guess, we're a forest state, and so forest songbirds and other birds of forest are of particular importance. So I'll round out my presentation with that. But without further ado, I can talk about bald eagles. Definitely relevant given the great cam that NCTC has on these pair of eagles. They're great ambassadors. So if we can go to the first slide, I can get started with that. So one of the things that we always have had a kind of a big question about is what was the presence of bald eagles in West Virginia prior to the early 1980s when we discovered our first active nesting pair. If we go back in time, there's a lot of historical reporting on birds in the state. And from what we can tell, bald eagles have long had a presence in West Virginia. They've been found throughout the year, winter, spring, summer, and fall. But for many decades, it was just individual birds or incidental observations. Folks would see birds, but there was never really any compelling evidence that they were nesting. So believe it or not, as far as we know, since settlement, there have been no nesting bald eagles in West Virginia. That's probably inaccurate. If I were to speculate, I would say probably there were a few, but at the very least, they were quite scarce. So beginning in 1981, I should say, we discovered our first bald eagle nesting pair in the Trough, which is a valley that the south branch of the Potomac River flows through on its way north. Eventually, the Potomac obviously flows right past NCTC. And for several years, this was the only nest in the state. But gradually, the count of nests started to increase. We can go to the next slide. If we can advance to the next slide. Okay, so fast forward to 1997, where we had a grand total of 6 nests. So it took from 1981 to 1997 to gain 5 more nests in addition to the first nest that appeared in the Trough. So it was a very slow beginning to an exploding population of bald eagles, and you might expect that to follow a geometric curve, if you will. And notice that all of these nests are within a particular region of the state. They're in the eastern panhandle, what we call the ridge and valley, these long ridges with these flat valleys that are often agricultural in nature. The Potomac and its tributaries flow through this part of the state. It is fantastic habitat for inland bald eagles. If you continue on from there, next slide to 2005, you'll see, again, eagles are restricted primarily to the ridge and valley or the eastern panhandle, but the density has increased quite a bit. And there are some places now where bald eagle nests are spaced as little as a half-mile apart along the south branch of the Potomac River. You continue with that trend to 2010, and you can start to see that nests are starting to show up in other parts of the state. It's not just the ridge and valley where they've continued to add a few nests, but it's quite dense. You start to see some movement up higher into the mountains and places like Tucker County, but also note our first nest along the Ohio River in the very northern tip of the panhandle of West Virginia. If you continue on from there to 2016, you'll see another remarkable shift. Over just the space of 6 years, multiple nests have now appeared in the New River watershed. West Virginia is famous for its New River Bridge, which crosses a large gorge that the New River creates. And again, fantastic habitat for bald eagles down there, steep ridges, wide rivers, a lot of hunting opportunities. But also note that eagle nests have spread along the Ohio River, and even there are several scattered nests inland in central areas of the state. So now if we fast forward to 2023, which is where we are now, you'll see there's quite a few nests now. As a matter of fact, we've now documented 148 nests in West Virginia since the species showed up in 1981. And now we would speculate that the species bald eagles have reached carrying capacity in the ridge and valley. That means they've pretty much maxed out their habitat, and there's increasing competition among birds, and there's actually a modest reduction in breeding productivity because of that competition and the lack of available nesting sites. I would also speculate that along the Ohio River, the same thing has happened. The nests are spaced quite closely along the Ohio River. As many nests as there are on the West Virginia side, there are also probably quite a few on the Ohio side as well. But again, we're seeing an increase in nest counts in the inland part of the state, away from the biggest rivers, and nests appear to be stacking up on tributaries to the big rivers. And so now we're seeing a lot more nests along the Ohio River, not the Ohio, the Kanawha River, which feeds into the Ohio. But if you look at the southwestern part of West Virginia, that part of the state is famous for being the coal fields, where coal mining is really prevalent. There's a lot of history of coal mining in the state. But even in the coal country, nests are starting to appear in places like Boone and Logan County. So it's very exciting. We see a continued increase just this year. We've already documented more than 10 new nests. That seems to be a trend that's continuing. So we go on to the next slide. I want to show you a little bit about what nesting habitat looks like in West Virginia. A lot of people are familiar with nests along places like the Chesapeake Bay or coastal areas where nesting bald eagles can be quite abundant and quite dense. Nests can be spaced very close together. In West Virginia, the habitat is certainly different, and the food opportunities are not as great as they might be in places like the Chesapeake Bay. But nonetheless, these are the types of places that we see them. Oftentimes it's a sycamore along a river, or it's a big white pine on the right, up above the river. And in the slide, in the picture to the right, there's a nest in that white pine outlined in red, and right across from that river is a poultry operation. And each year that nest suspiciously fledges 3 chicks every year. And you can kind of wonder why that would be. But these are the types of places that you would expect to see nests. When nests first appeared in West Virginia, we intensively monitored them. We made many visits to individual nests to check on how the eagles were doing, how the chicks were doing, getting very detailed information in terms of fledging, numbers of fledged birds, et cetera. And as time has gone on and nests have proliferated, we've had to walk back the degree of monitoring that we do, but that's in part because they have been so successful, and we're very happy about that. But still these days, we visit each nest at least once, and we monitor them just to assess whether they're active or not. So getting into some threats to eagles, and again, bald eagles in particular are doing incredibly well. We have a higher conservation concern for golden eagles, but one of the biggest things that threatens eagles here in the east is poisoning from lead. And lead is often reaches the eagles through their consumption of carcasses. They scavenge a lot. If a deer was shot and there are embedded lead fragments, or if a hunter left a gut pile with lead fragments embedded in there, the eagles will consume those fragments and accumulate lead in their system. Oftentimes, the lead reaches sublethal effects, where the birds are disoriented or otherwise ill, and they can be found and collected and taken to a wildlife rehabilitator. Unfortunately, there are also other cases where eagles have such a high degree of lead exposure that they have to either be euthanized or they are found dead. And so to date, since 2003, we've collected 22 eagles in West Virginia, 19 bald eagles and 3 golden eagles that had signs of lead exposure that would lead to either the bird being grounded and very sick, or having to be euthanized, or the bird was found dead. And there are definitely some options that folks can take to reduce the degree of lead exposure in eagles. One of the most simple is for hunters to consider using non-toxic ammunition, which obviates the problem, or barring that, hunters may choose to transport their gut piles or away from where they shot the deer, or bury them. There are different options, but removing the lead from the environment is the solution to this problem. It's not just eagles that are exposed to lead. There are other scavenging birds and raptors that also suffer effects from lead exposure. Beyond lead exposure, we also have concerns about rodenticides, specifically second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Probably most raptors and scavenging birds have some degree of exposure to these pesticides. We don't have a lot of information in terms of true prevalence, because it's very difficult and costly to do assays for rodenticides in birds that are taken in by wildlife rehabilitators. But that's another example of a contaminant that is on our radar that we are paying attention to. We can go to the next slide. So another big threat to eagles is mortality from collision. And there's two main ways that eagles are killed by collision. One is at roadside. There's a carcass along the roadside, and the eagle is feeding on that and is then hit by a car. Alternatively, they can be killed or injured by collision with, for example, wind facilities and wind turbines. We've experienced this in West Virginia. To date, 3 bald eagles have been killed by wind turbines, and we are sure that the number has probably been greater than that, and we anticipate additional eagles will be killed. As an agency, we work closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service and companies to try our best to mitigate this risk. That is ongoing, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is in the process of releasing a new eagle rule that will increase, hopefully, the number of wind companies that have received permits from the service for eagle take, and they are then required to offset that take by otherwise reducing risk of eagles or reducing risk of eagle deaths. I can continue the next slide. So finally, we often encounter situations where eagles have, by no intent on the part of humans, been injured or killed. That can range from eagles getting caught in leg traps to, unfortunately, eagles getting shot, on the other hand, which we follow up with law enforcement action. But in general, eagle deaths are not too frequent, but they do occur. And if you were to ask us what our biggest concern is with eagles in the east, it is most likely lead exposure. And there's a lot of work to be done to assist hunters in voluntarily making switch from lead to non-lead ammunition. It's a choice that hunters choose to make, and our hope is that we can present them with options and alternatives that would reduce the incidence of lead in the environment. So finally, in terms of risks, I misspoke. There's one other topic I want to talk about, and that's the recent arrival of highly pathogenic avian influenza in North America. We can go to actually, no, we don't have a next slide, but I'll just talk a little bit. But no, we do have a next slide. Go ahead and advance. So highly pathogenic avian influenza is primarily a disease that's affecting waterfowl and water birds. It's also a big concern for producers of domestic poultry, and it has, since its arrival, spread throughout the country. And it has affected eagles, and it seems to affect eagles more than it affects other birds. So one of the concerns with eagles is they seem to be exposed to avian influenza along coastal areas through their hunting and consumption of waterfowl. There have been recent studies in Georgia and Florida that take a look at breeding productivity, and they've noticed that breeding productivity has dropped by as much as 30% or so. That's a big concern. Fortunately, eagles that nest in inland areas away from the coast may have less exposure to highly pathogenic avian influenza. And if you take a look at West Virginia, we to date have only had a single documented case of AI, that's what I'm going to call it, and that was in a Canada goose in Pocahontas County in the Highlands. We have no documented instances of AI in the domestic poultry industry, and our wildlife rehabilitation centers have not received any eagles that have tested positive for AI. So in West Virginia right now, our concern is relatively low when you compare to coastal areas like Georgia and Florida, where folks are trying to figure out what can be done about the problem. It is concerning, and it could theoretically reduce productivity going forward beyond this year. But so far in West Virginia, things appear to be good. If you look at the national scale, 455 eagles have been documented as have died in link with AI. That's quite a big number. That's roughly 6% of the total of all the wild birds that have died from AI. And so it's not insignificant. So again, it's something we're watching. We frequently get questions about it, but here in West Virginia, at least, avian influenza seems to have minimal presence. I'm certain it's present in the state, but again, it's not being documented. We are not getting intakes of eagles or other birds with exposure to AI. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about golden eagles. Something I'm very excited about. I like sharing information about golden eagles because most people are not aware that we have them. If you want to advance to the next slide. So golden eagles in West Virginia they've long been present in West Virginia, and there is a eastern golden eagle population. If you were to delineate this eastern population, I'm basically talking about Manitoba and Canada, all the way east to Newfoundland and south to the southeastern United States. Now, golden eagles are not a breeding bird in West Virginia. We only have them in the wintertime, and they are, unlike bald eagles, who you could frequently see perching on trees along rivers or soaring or otherwise just being visible at roadside. Golden eagles are much less frequently spotted. Not only are they less abundant, but they're less frequently spotted in West Virginia because they spend a lot of their time in the forest. You can think of a golden eagle in the east as a forest bird. And so two pictures here are golden eagles that were caught on trail cameras. On the left is one bird that may be going after a small deer. On the right is a golden eagle on the ground chasing a wild turkey. And anecdotally, it seems that one of the biggest food sources, or a major food source, of golden eagles in West Virginia's central Appalachian Mountains is wild turkeys. If we were to speculate at the total size of the eastern golden eagle population, we might guess that it's about 5,000 birds or so. If we look at the timing of their presence in West Virginia, they're most abundant November through April. But believe it or not, golden eagles have been spotted here in West Virginia in every month of the year, even though we do not have any evidence that golden eagles nest in the state or that they have ever nested in the state. We can go ahead to the next slide. And so there was, for a long time, we didn't really have a good sense of the population abundance or presence or occurrence or its distribution in West Virginia or the Central Appalachian Mountains. We knew that they were here, and as early as the 1990s, there were studies, small studies that put GPS telemetry devices on eagles to track their movements. But research did not really begin in earnest on golden eagles until the early 2000s. And from 2008 to 2013, there were about 172 camera trap sites that were set up in the eastern United States. And these traps involved the placement of deer carcasses that were staked to the ground, and a game camera was set up. And we then received, over that span of time, many hundreds of thousands of images. And it did a great job of helping us delineate the presence and a very coarse estimate of relative abundance of golden eagles in the east. And this picture here is a classic picture of a golden eagle sitting next to a carcass. In the background are the ever-present common ravens that also, it's a very common scavenging bird these days. In the Appalachians, they're almost always at these bait sites as well. But it helped us identify areas of core abundance for golden eagles. And what leapt out to researchers is that Virginia and West Virginia in particular, but also other states in the Central Appalachian Mountains like Pennsylvania, have particularly notable populations of wintering golden eagles. We can advance to the next slide. And so again, here's an example of one of the pictures that we got. We got so many good pictures, but this is just to document that it's not just golden eagles that would show up at these bait sites. Bald eagles would show up as well, and frequently there would be interspecific competition at these bait sites. Their fights would ensue. But again, eagles are scavenging birds, and camera traps are a great way to document presence and abundance. It's a low-cost means of getting an estimate for an otherwise very secretive raptor. We can go on to the next slide. So another big accomplishment this time in the United States using GPS telemetry is again use of GPS backpacks that are placed on golden eagles. They're big enough to carry such devices, and because of that, we're able to actually nearly track golden eagle movements in real time. And on the left are the flight paths of multiple golden eagles from their wintering grounds in the Central Appalachian Mountains, as far south as Georgia or Alabama, up to their breeding grounds. So in the east, golden eagles breed in Canada, and in Canada, primarily we're talking about Quebec, Labrador, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick a little bit. Golden eagles used to breed in some northeastern states, Maine and New York in particular, but there's been no recent breeding activity. They seem to be, at least for the time being, extirpated from the continental United States as a breeding species. But the map on the left gives you a great sense of their movements, and you can see that the Appalachian Mountains figure prominently as they move up and down. Again, those mountains form a great corridor. Those ridges create updrafts that are perfect for soaring, and so they're big flight pathways. And that's borne out in data from raptor observatories, these ridgetop observatories where people do hawk watches and things like that. And if you want to get another estimate of abundance of species like eagles, but also hawks or falcons, you can take a look at year-to-year count at hawk watches. And if you collect those data across hawk watch sites, you can get a big enough data set that you can infer some information in terms of trends. So if I were to hazard a population trend for the eastern golden eagle population, it appears to be stable. It's not increasing the way that bald eagles have greatly increased, but also they're not decreasing precipitously either. It appears to be a stable population, which is, in the face of things, relatively good news. On the right, you'll see that we've got a map of example of telemetered birds in West Virginia that highlights some of the areas of core occupancy in the state. and this kind of highlights the cross-border concentrations between Virginia and West Virginia. But if you're in West Virginia, golden eagle abundance is thought to be higher in the Allegheny Mountains, the Highland counties, some of these more heavily forested areas of the state. We can go to the next slide. So if you dial it down even further, GPS telemetry has enabled us to do some research on home range size and how golden eagles move on the landscape at the local scale in terms of setting up winter territories. And so this is an area that's not too far away from where I live here in Elkins, West Virginia. But again, you can see there's clustering in various places, but this again helps us get a sense of how big an area do wintering golden eagles roam while they're not initiating or in the process of migrating north or south. So again, this data is incredibly useful. We've gotten a lot of good information from it. And again, the telemetry studies were primarily conducted between 2006 and 2015, and a lot of other studies have used those data to assess abundance. And most recently, there's research that's trying to develop a relative abundance map for golden eagle that could then plug into efforts to assess risks of golden eagles to, for example, collision with wind facilities. And if we're able to estimate relative risk of eagle collision with wind facilities, we can better identify actions that companies could take to offset that risk if golden eagles were to be killed. As far as I know right now, no golden eagles have been killed by a wind facility in the eastern United States. Don't quote me on that. I can say for sure that in West Virginia, no golden eagles have been taken. So we'll transition from here to another type of telemetry that we use for birds in terms of getting research done, because again, one of the biggest things that we think about in the bird conservation world these days is what we call full annual cycle conservation. In other words, it's not just enough to protect birds or do conservation for birds on their breeding grounds. We have to also pay attention to the periods during the year when they're migrating and the periods during the year when they're wintering. And so for songbirds, for example, if we have a wood thrush in West Virginia that's nesting in some nice deciduous forest, we can look around, and there's a lot of great wood thrush habitat in West Virginia, but wood thrushes aren't necessarily doing so well. We have to think about what's happening to wood thrush in other places, like Central America, where it spends the winter, or during its flight south and north. Migration is a very risky endeavor. And so I'd like to highlight a big tool that we're using these days. We call it, it's the Motus Wildlife Tracking System. And basically it is a automated radio telemetry platform. And one of the great things about Motus is the devices that you affix to birds are very, very lightweight. So for example, with golden eagles, they're large enough birds that we can put backpacks on them with batteries and GPS, and the birds can fly around. But there's a weight cost to the basically, if you put something that's too heavy on a bird, it can cause it to have to spend more energy. It can make it more risky to the bird's survival. So the Motus tags, they're these little tags. We place them on birds. They're very lightweight, and the birds go on their way. And if you look at this map, we have hundreds of Motus towers. If you were to look at a Motus tower, it looks a lot like a big radio antenna. And so if a bird is fitted with a Motus tag and it flies past one of these towers, it'll ping the tower, and we'll get a sense of, we'll know that the bird was present for a certain amount of time within the radius of a tower. Usually a tower detection radius is around 7 miles or so, but topography can really change that. Here in the Appalachian Mountains, where terrain is very rugged, towers don't necessarily have as large a range. But again, we're placing these towers rapidly across the eastern United States and elsewhere. We have 6 towers right now installed in West Virginia. and we're anticipating installing more. But again, the tags are very light and they're relatively low cost. And so this is kind of the wave of the future in terms of being able to assess movements of birds. Because if we know where birds are, what their movements are, if we know where a wood thrush in West Virginia goes when it's in migration, where it ends up on its wintering grounds, and the timing of that, we can begin to think about what some of the limiting factors for that species might be, and we can, here in West Virginia, begin to think about investing our money, not just on the breeding grounds, but also in the wintering grounds, which is a model that we're working towards. Can we move to the next slide? So on the left here, again, is just a picture of a MODIS tower that we installed at the Hanging Rock Raptor Observatory down in southeastern West Virginia. This is a hawk watch site. It's up on top of a ridge. It's a perfect place to put a MODIS tower. We spent a couple days getting the tower installed. And so if you look at the central image here, this is a wood thrush. This is the type of data that you would get from MODIS towers. And so you have individual birds, and you look at these straight lines. It's not like a GPS backpack where you see just minute to minute where the bird is. It's like connecting the dots. But it's better than nothing, and particularly given the cost, it's very useful. And as we get more towers installed, those long lines will become shorter lines, and we'll eventually end up with a much clearer picture in terms of the paths that these birds are taking. Again, if we can correlate our conservation work towards areas of concentrations across the annual cycle, we'll be able to move the needle a little bit. So on the right here, if you look, there's a map of all the states that are currently participating in a research project that's coming up. Every state is going to be Every state is going to be participating and placing MODIS tags in West Virginia, across state, but we're going to be placing 20 to 25 tags here in West Virginia. We're really excited about that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties there. So last thing I'd like to talk about is, again, these big picture conservation priorities that we have. And when I say big picture, it's not just West Virginia, it's the bird conservation community as a whole in the United States. So in 2019, a paper came out that basically put the bird conservation world into a state of what I would call collective panic. And it documented the continental decline of bird life in North America. And if you look at this left slide here, left picture, since 1970, nearly 3 billion birds by number have been lost in North America. And that translates to be between 1/4 and 1/3 of all birds by number are gone relative to 1970. And obviously that's a huge concern for us. That's not to say there are not bright spots. If you look at waterfowl, for example, or if you look at raptors, those groups have generally fared well. But on the right, if you take a look at, for example, eastern forest birds, West Virginia has a large amount of population responsibility for songbirds. Again, I'm going to use wood thrush as an example. 6 in 10 wood thrushes have been lost since 1970. Even though we can go for hikes in woods here in West Virginia or elsewhere, and you hear the absolutely beautiful song of the wood thrush, we can still go to places where the bird is quite common, but it's deceptive. We've lost 60% of our wood thrushes. In West Virginia, it's not too different. And so when you look at places like West Virginia, where we have 10% of the global breeding population of wood thrush, there's an onus on us to spend time conserving this bird. There's another bird, for a songbird that's of huge importance to us, called the cerulean warbler. In West Virginia, we have more than 1/3 of the global breeding population. So again, we have an obligation. So last thing I want to talk about is just how we think about conservation in terms of the actions that we do and how we prioritize our time and work. Like most wildlife agencies and a lot of corners of the conservation world, we don't have the money or the staff capacity that we would love to have to get a lot of work done. But in West Virginia, our biggest priority is conservation of birds on private lands. And oftentimes, traditionally, we think about public lands as being the best opportunities to get work done. And it's true. Public lands are great places to get work done. And we have roughly 1 million acres, give or take, of WMAs or public lands that we manage in West Virginia. And there's a lot of opportunity to get work done. But if you look at land ownership in the state, public lands definitely the great minority in terms of acreage in the state. If we really want to have a big footprint in terms of protecting forests and forest birds, we have to pay attention to private lands. So that's a huge focus for us going forward. On the left here are two birds that we spend a lot of time thinking about. On the top is the golden-winged warbler, which has experienced an absolutely catastrophic population loss in the Appalachian Mountains, more than 90% loss. It's a bird of what we call early successional forests. And on the bottom is the cerulean warbler. Again, I mentioned that just a minute ago. It's a beautiful treetop bird that uses canopy gaps to forage. It spends the summers in places like West Virginia, again, where we have more than 2/3 of the breeding population, but they winter down in places like Venezuela and Colombia. And so one of the big issues that we face here in the Appalachian Mountains is a legacy of past poor forest management. And so West Virginia is 80% forested, and that's great, but we have a big issue with the quality of those forests. And a lot of people think when they're driving around or driving through the mountains, they see the sea of trees and this closed canopy forests. And again, if you go into these forests, they're all about the same age because they were all logged at about the same time. They're about 80 to 100 years old in the stand. Again, the canopy is closed over the top. There's no canopy gaps. If you look in the understory, often the understory is degraded by invasive species or overbrowsing by white-tailed deer. So if you were to ask me what the biggest tool is at our disposal to improve the conditions for these forest songbirds, it's actually timber management. People are really surprised when I say, we're in the business of cutting trees. And at least here in the Central Apps, cutting trees is what we have to do to improve the structure of those forests for birds. One of the interesting things that we've learned in recent decades is that birds like wood thrush or cerulean warbler, they thrive, and golden-winged warbler, they thrive in what we call a mosaic of forest age classes and structures. So in other words, even though a wood thrush builds its nests in a closed canopy, dense, what you call a mature forest, when young fledge out of the nest, they pretty soon afterwards go in search of early successional habitat, open shrubby areas like you might see on the rightmost photograph here in this slide. And there they forage and gas up before they undertake their first migration south. So it's not a simple picture. What we want to see is a forest landscape that has multiple age classes, multiple structures, from that primeval forest that we all love to think about to stands that have a lot of young forests and just a few tall standing trees. And that type of landscape lends itself well to working with private landowners, in particular industrial forest landowners. We partner with companies like Weyerhaeuser to take a look at how their forest practices might benefit birds. But again, our biggest effort is on private lands, and our biggest priority is forest songbirds. With that, I know I'm short on time. I'll cut it off there. Thanks for listening to me ramble here about various topics. I'm happy to answer questions for 10 minutes or so if folks have them.
Well, thanks very much, Richard. That was a great overview of bald eagles, golden eagles, and our songbirds in not just West Virginia, but throughout the Appalachians and up into Canada, too. Very interesting. Deb's got a question for you here. She's wondering about the cause of no eagle nesting pairs. Was for many years there were no or minimal nests. Was that due to DDT, or were there some other causes?
So one of the interesting things, and we've thought about that, is that there were no records of nesting eagles or eagle pairs prior to the beginning of use of DDT. Okay, so it's not like West Virginia had a breeding population of eagles. DDT arrived, and then we saw a dropout of breeding pairs of eagles. We simply never had a breeding population of eagles, as far as we know, based on the reports that we have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it was, we speculated where this nest came from originally. Did they come from the mountains up in, as you showed on the map, the region in the Potomac Highlands had a lot of nests from 81 onward. So my guess is that this nest pair could have come from there originally, or they could have come from Chesapeake Bay upstream on the Potomac, because there's a lot of nests over there too. But I don't know why. I just sort of think they came downstream from the trough area, as your map showed.
Yeah, we can only speculate in terms of how the population spread. Generally speaking, if you think about it, you might expect areas like the Chesapeake Bay, where there was an initial surge of abundance as the species began to recover, that you would end up with young birds fledging from those nests and prospecting into other areas. But it's hard to say, specifically where the birds came from that started up our first nest. And again, it was quite a few years until we started to see a real uptick in numbers of nests. Through the 80s and 90s, there were just a few nests, but in the 2000s, it really began to take off.
Leslie's got a question. She's asking, once Jefferson, our juvenile here, fledges, are you or someone able to keep track of him or her? How is that accomplished? How long is it done? Well, Leslie, we have never banded any of these eagles, but I will ask Richard if, is anyone in West Virginia banding bald eagles these days? Do you know, Richard?
The short answer is no. There are no current banding efforts for bald eagles. I'll reference back to the studies I talked about with golden eagle that concluded in 2015. If a golden eagle was trapped and fitted with a GPS transmitter, they were also banded in that process. But again, that focused on golden eagles. Oftentimes, we work with species that are of elevated conservation concern. We spend our capacity there. And these days, bald eagles are doing great. That's not to say there won't be opportunities or needs in the future to ban bald eagles and track their movements. But at this point, our efforts are being spent elsewhere, given the success of the species. Again, I would point at golden eagles.
Just a little bit of background, Leslie. 30, 40, 50 years ago, when bald eagle populations were way down and state agencies were bringing young eagles in from Canada, even Alaska, and transporting them for repopulating, then there was a lot of banding and tracking going on to understand how those efforts were working out. But since those populations have come back up, as Richard mentioned, not so many places are banding bald eagles these days. Jesse had a question. Since lead ammo costs more, why do hunters continue to choose it?
That's a very simple question, I think, with a pretty complicated answer. I think part of it is economics. Non-toxic ammunition is more expensive. It's less widely adopted. I think there's a cultural affinity for lead ammunition. I think that a lot of hunters are liking the ballistics of lead ammunition. They might have concerns that the ballistics of non-toxic shot are not as good, for lack of a better term. There's a lot of different answers to that question that we've seen. I will say that there's research happening right now to better identify what motivates hunters, or what might motivate hunters to make a transition to non-toxic shot. One of the issues that is also the case is non-toxic shot is just not as widely available. Even if someone would want to use it, they're not necessarily going to find it in the store. That's a supply and demand issue. But there are efforts underway to better understand the human dimensions of ammunition use and how that might translate into wider adoption of non-toxic ammunition. Because again, lead, if you were to ask me the question, what is the single biggest threat to eagles in certainly the Appalachian Mountains, if not broadly, it would be exposure to lead through ingestion of fragments and carcasses and gut piles.
And Lori G had a comment here. During raptor migration, we've gone to the Allegheny Front Hawk Watch in Pennsylvania to see golden and bald eagles riding the wind stream along the ridge. You are eye level with them. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. There's a place not far from here, Boonesboro, Maryland, along the Appalachian Trail, where there's a nice observation tower you can climb, and a really famous place up in northeast Pennsylvania, Hawk Mountain, where Rachel Carson used to go up there to watch the birds migrate. So that's a lot of fun in the spring and fall, seeing the balds and the goldens migrating, lots of other hawks as well. In fact, Doug included a little bit ago a link to sites. It's called hawkcount.org, where you can find sites that might be nearest you to go and do those observations. So thanks for doing that, Doug. Let's see, Deb had a follow-up question regarding back to the DDT and when there were no nests we could see in West Virginia. Was that because there was a lack of tracking data of nesting bald eagles back then?
So one thing that you could speculate on is simply that there might not have been a lot of people back then looking for eagles or looking for birds. Doing not doing as much birding. Certainly, birding has a lot more visibility these days than it might have had, say, at the turn of the 1900s. Fortunately, in West Virginia at least, we have an ornithological society that began really in earnest and started forming in the 20s, but really got rolling in the early 30s. And so beginning in the 20s, again, this is before DDT arrived on the scene, there was quite a bit of birding happening in the state. And that Ornithological Society has annual events where they will go and basically blitz a geographic part of the state. And every year they do a different area, and they do these intensive surveys for all birds. Certainly that would include eagles. And so that's the primary data source that we draw upon, but even before then, we had naturalists in the state that birded widely and published their reports. I'm thinking about people like Maurice Brooks, for example, for whom the Brooks Bird Club, his family's named after. In any case, the reporting that we have before the arrival of DDT, there are no reports from any of those forays or outings or from anywhere else that documented a bald eagle nest. Again, I certainly would not overextend myself to say that there wasn't a bald eagle nest in the state back then or before DDT, and DDT may have had an effect on that. It's just simply that we don't have the confirmation from the data that we have.
If you're interested in the history of that, fairly new book, about a year ago, Jack Davis put out a book called The Bald Eagle. And it's got a lot of the history of reintroductions, populations, going way back to the young continent of North America. Very interesting read. So Leslie was kind of had a follow up here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, don't interrupt if I may. It's a good opportunity just to note to folks that in 2021 we published the second Atlas of Breeding Birds in West Virginia. And it's basically now the definitive source for bird life in West Virginia. and it includes historical information of all species that we found breeding in the state. That includes bald eagles, but everything else as well. I just wanted to highlight that for folks that have interest in bird life in the state. If you Google it, you can find it on Amazon and other places, but it's the desktop reference, and it does include historical information, information that we have collected for all species.
And that's called the Breeding Bird Atlas of West Virginia?
It's the second atlas of breeding birds in West Virginia.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, Leslie's question about tracking was related to survival rates of young juvenile birds, wondering how they survive. Well, one of the things we know, Leslie, from years past is that the first year is the critical year for a young eagle. If they can get by the first year, and if I remember, the figure that sticks out in my head is about 50-50. Is that correct, Richard? Survival rate of young bald eagles?
I'd have to go and look at the exact figure there, but that does seem to be the right ballpark. Again, what I'll say is that juvenile survival rate is highly variable based on the region and the habitat and the specific circumstances of the nests where the birds fledge. So, for example, it might be more appropriate to look at the population, the particular population of eagles. So in other words, say you're talking about juvenile survival for the Chesapeake Bay population. That might be different in an area that has definitely reached carrying capacity. There's a lot of competition for nest sites. There's a lot of fights, for lack of a better word, or agonistic behavior between eagles, as opposed to areas of the state, areas like the Appalachian Mountains, where there are still quite a few places that have yet to have eagles colonize. Those nests might have different food resources to draw upon. There's just a lot of different circumstances. If you were to globalize juvenile survival across all of North America, you might have a figure like that. But again, I'd have to go and look specifically at the literature.
Let's see. Deb had a question. Are there any conservation incentives being promoted for hunters to use non-lead ammunition, even though it's more expensive?
There are, in terms of subsidizing the cost of lead ammunition. To the best of my knowledge, there have been some test studies and some experiments with that. There's research going on right now out in the western United States that's taking a look at that issue. They're providing free ammunition, and they're assessing the degree to which hunters are actually using that ammunition, what their behavior is if the cost has been removed from the equation. For example, if we're talking about a subsidy, this is the best subsidy. They're freely distributing non-toxic ammunition to hunters. No cost to you, just agree to take this survey or provide us data, and here's your ammunition. That's basically the model that they're using. But they're then doing follow-up and getting responses from hunters to see what their behavior actually was. Again, it's testing the efficacy of subsidy programs like that. But in the loosest sense, it is definitely a strategy that has the attention of conservation folks. It's just a matter of quantifying the degree to which it is effective. Again, we have to identify the most effective means to make a cultural shift. Because we're looking at voluntary actions by hunters. In other words, we want to present a situation to them where they're making their own decision about what to purchase. There's this widely available non-toxic alternative. They've perhaps learned that the ballistics work and they can continue to hunt. Obviously, as an agency, we're very pro-hunting. But again, we need to quantify the degree to which it's actually effective.
We'll go for one last question here from Lori G. Do you think industry standards in our tri-state area are changing enough, and cleaning up of our rivers, mine drainage, for example, is getting better?
So there's a lot of different land uses that are having impacts on waterways. in the tri-state area. I can call it the Central Appalachian Mountains. I can speak for West Virginia. If you're in the Eastern Panhandle, and you've got, again, that ridge and valley where most of the bald eagles are, a lot of the effects over there are nutrient loading from for lack of a better word, fecal matter entering the water and contaminating it. You get eutrophication and algae blooms and things like that. That affects water quality, poultry operations, things like that. That contrasts with the effects that we see down in the southern coal fields, where you have widespread coal mining. Mountaintop removal coal mining is the primary model. There's severe impacts to tributaries, to rivers with valley fills. You can get loading with metals, toxic metals, et cetera. And so it depends on where you are. We are just now starting to see bald eagles colonize the coal fields, and we're finding nests. We have not yet, in West Virginia, endeavored to investigate the degree of loading of contaminants that those bald eagles are suffering regards to accumulation in terms of their prey items. They're getting fish out of the water, and obviously they're accumulating those types of metals. We have not quantified that here in West Virginia. Of the two, I would be more concerned about effects in the coal fields with the metals versus waterway pollution from agricultural runoff. I will say that if we look at the population trajectory for bald eagles, it's very strongly positive in the state. So if there are factors that are limiting the birds and reducing their productivity, it is not doing so substantially.
Thanks, Richard. And one last question that I missed here from Carol. How does injury happen by wind turbines?
Loosely speaking, you've got a wind turbine up on a ridge top context, right? All the wind facilities in West Virginia are on ridge tops where the wind is the strongest, and those ridge tops are the same places that eagles migrate north and south. It's not just golden eagles, but it's also bald eagles. They're catching those updrafts, and they're soaring up on top of these ridge lines. So basically what's happening is the bald eagle is getting hit by one of the rotating blades of a wind turbine. As you might suspect, the end of the tip of some of those blades, I'm pulling out of my head here, but I believe they can go as fast as a couple hundred miles an hour. And so when an eagle gets hit with a rotating turbine blade, it's almost always a fatal event.
Yeah, and not just eagles, but other birds and bats as well. Yes. And that's a problem that the wind industry has. They're doing research to try to mitigate that. But yeah, to us on the ground, it looks like those blades are moving slowly, but the tip of the blade is going at least 150 miles an hour from what I've heard. And so, yeah, it's bad news if a bird gets in there. Well, Richard,
I'd say our biggest concern is bats.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Richard, thank you very much for sticking with us and answering the questions, and for a great presentation. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We will be back in 2 weeks, and our guests then will be Deb Steck and Paul Koenig from Bald Eagles 101. And we'll be back to check on the young one here. It looks like he's pretty calm right now. In the nest, just relaxing for a bit, but keep your eye on him. He's going to be jumping around doing more wing exercises, and any day now he's going to get on that upper perch, and he could be fledging within the next week. He'll be 11 weeks old this coming Sunday. Usually they fledge 11 to 12 weeks, so could be any time now. Keep your eye out and join us next time. Thanks for being with us today.